Welcome to episode 12 of 5D Tea Time. I'm your co-host, Lindsay Love, and this is
Krystal, Kristen.
So as we were having our pre-conversations, kind of digging into what's happening in both of our lives right now, I've been experiencing things with vulnerability this week and the power of vulnerability, but there's also an art to it as well. And being in a vulnerable place isn't always the easiest, but usually there's this beautiful growth and power that comes from it. So we thought today that we might dig into this topic of the art of vulnerability and see where it leads us. Kristen, want to kick this one off?
Sure.
How do you feel about vulnerability, or whatever you feel inspired to say? Let's hear it.
Well, I could say a lot of things about it, but maybe I'll start talking about the interpersonal part of vulnerability piece first. And to me, vulnerability, there's a softness, there's a laying down of arms, like a willingness to be wrong or to be incorrect or to be not right in some way. Or to not even have necessarily a defense ready. It's like, this is me in this moment. This is how I'm feeling. I'm not saying that my feeling is not necessarily accurate, yet it's real and it's true. It's truly here. So vulnerability feels very much self-loving,
Mm-hmm.
self-acknowledging of what is happening for me. Doesn't mean that it needs to even be changed or corrected or anything. It's just yeah, vulnerability, just acknowledging what is happening for me inside of me. A lot of times that comes into sensations, emotions, thoughts, and just being willing to feel that first and then provide enough safety for myself to feel it. And if I feel safe enough to feel it, then I feel I'm creating safety to share it with the other person. That's kind of, yeah, what it feels like to me to be vulnerable. The softness, there's a self-love there enough to listen to what that is, to feel it, to cry with it. So a lot of times vulnerability, tears come or nervousness comes, and it's just almost like holding vulnerability like a child.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, it's this freaked out part of us, um yeah, creating safety for myself to feel that is kind of the art of vulnerability to me. um yeah, being willing to be wrong and to not have the answers, but to just put it out there to start a process with another person to understand the vulnerability more. It's this is what I'm feeling. What are you experiencing? Because I want to understand this part of me more. Because I'm feeling really turned up or triggered, or it's I want to know what this is more. Can you help me understand this? In a sense. I don't know if I just went into process, but yeah, that's kind of what it is for me. Yeah, what is vulnerability to you? How do you handle, yeah, vulnerable moments in your life right now?
It feels like a very raw and egoless place.
Mm.
Like you were saying, there's an art to it. And to me, there's a rawness to it because it's like,
Mm.
hey, here I am standing without my clothes on, not really, but it almost feels like that. Like there's an exposure. But when I say ego less, it's like the need to share, like just the need to share and go deep
Mhm.
without trying to, like you said, defend oneself, or it's like, this is what I'm feeling, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm not, but within me this feels very real right now,
Mhm.
and it's something that needs to be addressed. It's something that via discussion and via the process you're talking about generally begins to fall away, because I think a lot of it stems from fear, especially for me, oftentimes. It's like and you brought up the word safety, and it's like, I notice I feel the most vulnerable when I feel afraid of the unknown or an outcome, the uncertainty of an outcome, or when I'm not in control.
Mhm.
Control is a big one. And maybe this is just the humanness in me, but it's nice to have control of situations or control of outcomes. We know what's going to happen. There's not a lot of uncertainty. There's not a lot of change or questioning. It's like, okay, I already know how this is going to go. But how realistic is it to live a life like that, in control all the time and knowing the outcome? It's not. It's very unrealistic, because I think that personally, the only thing that really does feel constant about life is the fact that it's ever changing, that it's constantly evolving. So that, of course, brings up fear. Fear brings up vulnerability, or change just in general brings up vulnerability. And the process of addressing it can be profound and transformative.
Yeah.
And so I think that vulnerability is one of the most beautiful things
Mm.
in life, because it can be the most transformative, not only for the person who's experiencing it, but for the other who is either directly connected to the reason why the person is feeling vulnerable, directly connected to the situation, or just by being vulnerable. I think you were saying this earlier, it allows the other to feel the comfort to do the same.
Yeah.
And with vulnerability, there always seems to be a depth of sharing
Mhm.
that maybe otherwise didn't exist or wouldn't have been discussed without that moment of vulnerability. And so these depths that can really be experienced via the process of the art of vulnerability, sharing, processing, if allowed by both parties or whomever's involved, can really strengthen the foundation of a relationship,
Mhm.
deepen it, and yeah, and really create a profound transformation within the situation.
Mhm. Yeah, disarming, is the word. Like when one kind of takes that seat of willingness to be exposed and raw to another person. Um, yeah, there's a disarming that happens often. I've always experienced it, almost always. Because I think the person's not being made feel wrong, or that they're being talked at like, well, I feel this way and it's your fault and you're wrong and this is right. It's like, well, this is my experience, this is what I'm feeling, and help me understand it better. Like what, yeah, yeah, this is, yeah, and it's a almost like a um there's a language for it. There's like, because it is connected to the emotional body, so there is like almost a growth in just language. Because a lot of times it's like, oh, there are no words to describe these feelings. It's like, oh, well, try anyway, try anyway. Just keep it simple, and the depth, as you said, that like evolves and grows in that space as you feel more safe and more comfortable. The words are there to describe those feelings. Um, yeah, it's very, very interesting. I love what you said too, just about the, you know, the constant of life is this ever changing nature of it. And I mean, being human, being on this planet, having a body is a very vulnerable thing. And we
Yeah.
can pretend that we're safe and like invincible from it mentally, emotionally, physically. The reality is like, we're vulnerable to the process of time and we're vulnerable to the process of life and death and birth and life and death. It's happening to all of us. And I think sometimes we have to pretend that's not happening. So there's this like kind of mask, a facade that is worn by all of us. Maybe we forget, that we are in this process of life. But when we really acknowledge that, I mean, there's a great vulnerability inside of all of us that's being affected by having a body. So, um, yeah, it was a great, great vulnerability just to the evolutionary journey. Um, very interesting.
So without vulnerability, wearing that mask, kind of bypassing it seems like this is almost a disservice to self, but not only to self, to potentially if it involves another with the vulnerability, which so often it does. Not always, but so often it does. What are your thoughts? I mean, is it a disservice to bypass it? Is it a disservice not to share with the other person the depth of feeling and emotion that may be experienced, whether positive or negative? What do you think?
Well, it's kind of the saying, "Know when to hold them and know when to fold them," comes to mind because every little
Mhm.
thing. If we're addressing every little thing, I mean, that would be amazing, actually, to do that. And um, if it's not caught initially, it'll come back around for sure. Because that trigger, that thing
Oh yeah.
that's alive inside of us, it'll just it's like, oh yeah, you didn't catch it this cycle, it's coming again. And then
Can
it's
you explain a little deeper what you mean by that? I think that's a really, you're kind of hitting a huge nail on the head here.
well, let's say like you're like triggered by something in passing, and it's like, oh, you catch it, you're kind of, oh, that stung, but it's that relationship's moving out the door. There's walking through to they say something and pass, like boom, that trigger happens. Well, it's that trigger and that dynamic between you and the other. That's a friendship or a coworker or a boss or a partnership of business or romantic. The intimate romantic relationships, um, and business partnerships, bosses, but the romantic relationships are, you know, the closest bond, to us. You usually, but the boss can be too. Um, but if it's not caught in that passing moment, I mean, that dynamic, there's a relationship there, something alive in them and something alive in you. We all come with our sensitive spots. And then, like, ways that we've built adaptations to like hide those sensitive spots. So when like that adaptation hits this adaptation and that sensitivity's like popped open, it's like, whoa, guaranteed it's coming back around. Like that personality and that adaptation is going to come hit this one and open it. And when it's like the timing, the thing is, the more you let it go and let it go, it grows, so it becomes more of a snowball. But when you kind of catch it earlier, it's like soft and, a little bit less volcanic to deal with, or eruptive. And still emotions feel like a volcano, it's just kind of how they rise with heat and whew, and then they calm down. It's just like a wave. So that wave comes, if you catch it early or at the end. But maybe if you wait too long, it's just all defenses, and it becomes like a battle. It's harder to become vulnerable when there's so much hurt accumulated in the story.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if we can catch it, if we can be more conscious about these triggers and yeah, access that art of vulnerability. Yeah, so yeah, I guess it's a moment. And you want to, I think, to be sure when we address the person, like make sure that they're available to be in that space. If they're busy doing something and you're trying to be vulnerable and their attention's not on you, you're going to feel even more hurt. So it's like,
Yeah.
oh, there's a vulnerability. Like, do you have the space, like, to um, be with me? I'm feeling, very sensitive about this interaction that we had, and what I'm feeling is this. But you want that other person to be, without their earbuds in and without the TV on. You really want
Mhm.
that presence
No
too.
distractions.
No distraction. Yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm just thinking about this idea of running away from things as well. So there is such an art to vulnerability. And I love that you brought up this concept of kind of this idea that it builds momentum over time, um, if not approached or not identified.
Mhm.
And like you said, it's kind of soft in the beginning if we catch it early, and then it builds, and then the more the situation builds, the more energy or emotion may be building out around it. So it becomes harder to become vulnerable. And I just think of defense mechanisms that we build, right? And running away may be one, or avoidance may be one. I mean, there's so many different ways that we can kind of defend and suppress something that's occurring that's making us uncomfortable, or maybe needs to be breached or approached or discussed. And what I've recognized is, in my younger years, I definitely would run from things because it seemed easier. And now I've gotten much, much better about that. I'm like, okay, just approach it. Like, make sure it's something, like, know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to approach it. But recognizing in the past that I would run from things, what I noticed is that those same things would manifest maybe in different people or relationships, but no matter where I went. So we can never really run. I mean, we can change relationships, we can change jobs, we can avoid if we want, we can run away if we want, but the likelihood of us really attracting the same situationship or same vibe or person, a relationship that we may need to work through something with, those same things kind of follow us. So until we can really identify them and recognize the vulnerability within them, and work through them and approach them, and so it's interesting because for me personally, on my journey throughout life, it's like I have recognized the importance of vulnerability, And I look back on how I used to live, and although it was beautiful and wonderful, I don't want to run away from things anymore. I want to feel them and also approach them from okay, this is me, and let's work through this,
Mhm.
and see how having those hard conversations and feeling the discomfort of vulnerability can really strengthen not only my foundation within myself, show myself self-love, but it also feels great not to run. It feels good just to yeah, to just to be present with everything that's happening and have those conversations when necessary. And the growth and the transformation that I've experienced from that has been very profound.
Mm. So you feel that kind of unlock, like in real time, that growth, that transformation. Like what happens for you when you're not running, but you're in that space of, maybe trembling, but, loving yourself
Yeah,
enough to stay.
yeah.
Yeah, what happens for you in those spaces of facing it and being with it, processing it, working with it?
There's a strength and power within it of the recognition of I I've focused awareness on making this change, and I'm doing it, first of all. So there's a beauty in that, for me.
Mm,
And then there's an empowerment in the fact of like approaching things head on, because ultimately running is avoidance, right? So for me, I would avoid, and then the same thing would come up, and I would avoid again, and the same thing would come up. So really approaching things head on, but from a vulnerable place, from an empathetic place, from a
mhm,
place of trying to drop my ego, which doesn't always happen. I mean, egos come in, they're there for a reason, and sometimes there can be a supercharge, but trying to be as vulnerable as possible is just so rewarding. I think not only for me, for my self growth, but also um, for the growth of my relationships in my life, and the depth of connection that I've noticed I can experience when being vulnerable enough to share
mhm,
and open the door for that conversation and the other person sharing as well.
mhm. Yeah, it's a deepening of the connection.
Mm,
A
yeah.
deepening of the connection with yourself, it sounds like. As I've always felt that too. It's almost like, oh, there's like a growing, healthy sense of self, like a healthy sense of confidence, self-confidence that like I'm willing to face myself and
Mm.
be vulnerable and be witnessed by another person, and I'm not dying. I'm not gonna die.
Even
Like,
though sometimes it feels like you're going to, or
yeah,
not you're going to, but I'm going to. I'm like, okay, my voice is shaking. Let's just, yeah.
totally, because
Wow.
it's fight,
Yeah.
flight, or
Yeah.
freeze. You ran, you were a flight,
Yeah.
some people freeze and just go into paralysis and suppress, in that
Yeah.
way. Some people fight, and put up all the defenses, but it's that same like adrenalized, instinctual space. And it is natural to do those things. And also, like, vulnerability is an act of kind of spiritual evolvement, where you're like, we're willing to be exposed and to process and to release this, because we're not dying, we're not running from the lion. We don't need all this adrenaline. Like, this perceived threat is actually not real. Like, what it might, the death is the ego death, but the vulnerability brings like a spiritual connection to oneself
Mm.
and to the other. It's like, wow, here we are, like exploring. Uh,
Mm.
and there's less like identification with that thing, when it's like
Mm.
willing to be seen and put into the light of like consciousness and conversation.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so I kind of see this like art of vulnerability really escalate as, this concept of like moving towards 5D. It seems like 5D is a more vulnerable place to be, whereas 3D is more like ego-based control, protection, avoidance. And then, moving in the spectrum towards 5D, we soften a bit, we become more vulnerable. And there's more of a willingness to share and deepen connection and to identify what is occurring within in order to bring back balance and harmony. Would that be, what's your thought process in regards to how 5D is related
Most
to the
definitely.
art of vulnerability?
The word transparency was coming to mind, like the fifth dimension being more of like a transparent, like nothing to hide here. Like, look how bright my soul is. Like, help me reveal that more so I can be free here, please. It's like, and I have this thing in me, and it's a wound. Like, help me see it. Like, please love love me enough to be with me to process this with you, because we're in this evolutionary dynamic here where this thing you triggered this thing in me, and I'm crying over here, and then it kind of like it balances, and then it neutralizes. It's like all that charge just dissipates, and then the heart opens. That's the 5D. Like, the process of vulnerability opens the heart, and then the 5D is accessed. Let's say it's like the alchemy of the vulnerability, then like boom, and then there we are. Like,
Yeah.
more radiant truth. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a strength that evolves there too, because vulnerability is soft. It's there's a fluidity to it, but as that like balancing and neutralizing happens, if the process does get worked through to completion, like when the heart really opens, there's a strength there. There's a transparency and a strength. um, it's not like you're susceptible. It actually creates a uh, like a buffer, almost like an immunity in the energy field, and the mind, and the heart, and the body. It actually, the immunity field in the cells, we're just less vulnerable to yeah, toxic substances, viruses, whether they're coming from another person's personality imprints, or in the ethers from the pollutions, or whatever, actual viruses. um yeah, that like alchemy does create an immunity field. But the process of vulnerability is like intrinsic to be there. Yeah.
Intrinsic, that's a good word for it. It's perfect.
That's a good topic. It's a good one.
Yeah, it really is.
How do you feel right now talking about it? Does it feel?
I feel so good about it. I feel like I've been in situations where, um, you know, the vulnerability, like there's an exchange, and maybe there was vulnerability on one side, but the other side wasn't willing, there wasn't a willingness to be vulnerable as much. So, and then, recognizing that as an exchange with like, so both parties, there has to be a willingness from both parties involved if you really want to experience that depth that we're discussing. Because as important as it is to be vulnerable and to share, it's just as important for that vulnerability to be received and kind of understood and almost reflected. And if it isn't, there becomes like a little bit of disruption in the there's a disruption in the connection, or there's a disruption in, and from what I've experienced, if you're on the side of being vulnerable but it isn't being well received, then that becomes a challenging place to be, because of course then you want to protect and you want to control, and kind of I want to protect my heart, and vulnerability is a scary place to be. But having exchanges where both parties are very willing to be vulnerable, and they see the power and the beauty in the vulnerability, that I really feel is an evolution in our consciousness, really, and preparation for moving timelines or moving towards 5D. But I recognize the importance of both parties involved appreciating and being willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I would say it's a test too of the depth of the relationship, because people who really, and there's a timing too. I mean, we have to, I guess, be patient with people too, but there's a, like your intimate relationship. Well, if there's not that capacity, to really hold that space for you, you know, that might be a difficult, yeah, thing to realize, or, but like in loving connections, like truly loving connections, that the other holding the space, and at least being willing to listen to your process, I think, yeah, is key, like you're saying. Or the boss, like a boss,
Yeah, I
let's
mean,
say if they really value,
family. Yeah,
what were you gonna say?
yeah. Well, I agree, intimate relationships, but I also think on friend level or family or boss, I mean, if there's like a block or a non-willingness to receive vulnerability or to have an exchange, a symbiotic exchange where both people are kind of able to share or at least receive, it can be, it kind of, then the relationship reflects the other, right? So if there's like a deflection of vulnerability from one party, then the other person can obviously feel that, and doesn't feel the willingness within them any longer to be as vulnerable or to share.
Yeah.
So it really, I mean, just in relationship alone, because of course vulnerability comes up at all different times, but in relationship, I think there really has to be an effort and an awareness on both sides, a willingness to have the exchange.
I think some people are just so freaked out, like, oh, it's conflict. Oh my gosh, there's tears. They start freaking out because they want everything to be okay.
Yeah,
Like,
I'm
oh
perfect.
my
Yeah.
gosh, I'm perfect. It's like, oh no, I mean, this isn't like being a little messy in this way is actually beautiful, yeah, just more life comes into the veins, into the atmosphere. It's like more life, rather than just locking it down and repressing it and pretending that all is okay. But sometimes, like, when things are up on the surface, like even with different transits, like we're, maybe things are a little bit more pushed up. People are getting a little bit more sick. There's a little more agitation. Things are bubbling up under the surface. Things sometimes don't look neat and tidy, and it's like, oh, we're in that transit, but it's like, but it's good, it's good. It's all that stuff that was under the surface that looked neat and tidy, but actually wasn't. It was just bubbling. It's like, oh no, this is the opportunity for like more life to come in. Ah. Am I making big eyes and big hands? I don't even look
No,
at
no,
myself.
no.
I should
I'm
look
just
at
like,
myself more.
no, you weren't. I'm just like, that's so resonant with me. Like there's such a beauty to the chaos,
Yes.
and
Yes.
so often we try to avoid it, but it just does a huge disservice to us, this avoidance, because we we suppress, and then it just builds until eventually an explosion may come up, or it can even transform into disease in the body. And so I don't know, so
Disease,
often I
breakup, quitting the
recognize,
job. You know,
yeah,
it's like, okay, then I just have to be done because like I'm so done with it because we didn't like address it. Yeah.
yeah. And just so often I've recognized, like, okay, yeah, I'm experiencing some chaos right now with this person or in this situation, and it feels messy and it feels horrible, and I got a knot in my stomach, and like my mind can't logically figure out what to do because it's all based on emotions. But once that thing works itself out, in hindsight, I always look back and I'm like, oh my God, it's so much better than I could have ever imagined.
Yeah.
Like, because that happened, because that chaos happened, we were able to move to this next level, or I was able to, get that promotion at work or whatever it is, but generally, generally the chaos is an opportunity, but we can't see it in the moment because it's so uncomfortable and we're so vulnerable. But in hindsight, and I love hindsight, I love reflection, I love looking back to see how I got to where I am. I'm like, oh, thank God for that chaos. That was the best thing that could have ever happened. Yeah, it felt really awful at the time, but my God, now I'm like better than ever.
I love what you were just saying too, that the emotions are high and you can't logically process it. Like with vulnerability, you don't know how it's going to unfold. Like there's like that's part of being vulnerable. It's like I can't figure this out on my own. Like it almost like it's beyond logic, like but it's like this is just me and this is kind of the mess that it is. And it's like and sussing it out, as you always say. I think it's an Aussie kind of thing you picked up, but like sussing it out, like in the process, what the process is of being vulnerable. Like we don't have to know who, what, when, where, why, how. It is the way it is. It just
Yeah,
is, and just bringing that isness forward, and letting it guide you, is yeah, is freedom. Yeah, I just love that little piece you said. I was like, oh yeah, that's a huge piece. Because sometimes people are like, okay, we need to have this conversation and we need to address this and this and this and this. That's not vulnerability. That's still in control, trying to
yeah,
logically, address a problem and find a solution.
yeah,
Vulnerability is like more in the sensation. This is how I feel. This
yeah.
is
In the
what's,
moment, like I
yeah,
don't have this bullet pointed out, like I'm just stream of consciousness here.
yes, my rawness. This is like,
Mhm.
yeah, what I'm experiencing, how I'm impacted, when this happens. And yeah, help me understand it better.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind. First, this too shall pass. So that's one of my most favorite quotes because it's so true. The only constant is change. And, we're here and we're having this human experience and it's filled with a plethora of emotions and they're this roller coaster sometimes. But ultimately, everything always passes, everything always changes, everything always transforms. So I think that's just a helpful reminder when we're really going through it, that it's not going to look like that forever. And then the other thing, and I learned this in Indonesia when I lived there, and it was just such a good um, thing that I tell myself, pelan pelan. So basically, what it means is slowly, slowly. When we're going through an emotional upheaval like that, or feeling incredibly vulnerable in our lives, we want to get out of it as quickly as possible, right? Because it's so uncomfortable. It's like, oh, I got to escape this. I got to fix it now. I got to do this. I got to do whatever I need to do to make it better. But sometimes it just needs to play itself out. And there's nothing we can do to make it better. And there's no logical answer. It's
Mhm.
like the emotions, everything just needs to process through. And so my friend used to always tell me, when I was kind of in a moment of uncertainty or the unknown or vulnerability, she'd just be like, Pilan Pilan, like slowly, slowly, take time, go surfing, go for a motorbike ride, take a nap, lay in your hammock, whatever you need to do. Um, but just allow things to unfold the way they're meant to, rather than trying to force an outcome.
Mhm.
and be vulnerable in the process. Because if we're all walled off and we're all blocked off and we're all protected, then we can't, it's the art of vulnerability, but the art of allowing is part of the vulnerability.
Yeah.
A big part.
Love that. Beautiful. That seems to wrap it up nicely. Palan palan. I love that.
Slowly, slowly.
Yeah. So may the force of palan palan be with us all. Slowly, slowly, patience in the process. Yeah.
Mm.
Oh, so, so good. Beautiful conversation, Lynn. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ooh, so good.
Mhm.
Love this topic so much. Thank you, Kristen.
Well, we hope you all enjoyed. And I needed 2 cups of tea for this conversation. I ran dry. Please like, share, subscribe. You know, if you're a parent and you have kind of more grown children, I was thinking about that this morning in yoga. It's like, oh, people, share these videos with your family. Especially the youth, the young 20 somethings. That are just entering the path and
Yeah.
need some positive conversation, positive psychology in their life. Yeah, these conversations are for them for sure, and for all of us. But the teenagers, really need support and positive role models, mentors. And yeah, we're here for them, especially the teenagers and early 20 somethings. But all of us, all of us, we're here for all of us. So, yeah, so much
Beautiful.
love to you all. Thank you, Lindsay. Mwah.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.